and Harvey, thank you for having me down. And it's great. I give presentations to a lot of groups, but this is the first time I've ever talked to Satan's slaves. Very happy to do that. So what I would ask is if you have questions, we wait till the end, because a lot of times I find that I answer the questions somewhere else down the line, but if you just have a really burning question that can't wait, feel free to jump in.
Can I interrupt a second?
Yes.
I did notice someone in the audience is videotaping. Is that acceptable?
We already talked about that.
Okay, great. All right. My apologies. Just checking. Oh, no. Nothing to hide. Nothing to hide. Okay.
So first off, just a quick background on who is Compassion Choices. And we are, why are we not advancing here? The nation's oldest and largest organization advocating for choice and control at the end of life. The organization itself is a little over 30 years old. It has its roots in the Hemlock Society, which over a number of years changed names, changed focus. Ultimately, in 2005, we merged with Compassion and Dying, as Harvey had mentioned during the little introduction. And so our history now is 30 years old, and we still have a lot of those Hemlock roots, but we've expanded, and we're working on a lot of other issues as well. And our basic focus is to support, educate, and advocate for better pain management, for honoring of patients' wishes at the end of life to advance healthcare directives, holding physicians accountable for not honoring advanced directives or for not properly treating pain or refusing to treat an individual based on their own religious or moral objections. And we're also trying to pass laws that are similar to the laws they have now in Oregon and Washington, where somebody who is competent and terminally ill can request a prescription from their physician for medication that helps them in their suffering when and if they feel that they need it. So one of the challenges of tonight's exercising the right to end of life choices in a world that others claim to control. And a lot of others claim to control what all of us are doing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. You can see there, God is pushing the end of life suffering button. First, I want to talk about what is aid in dying, just so we have an idea of what we're going over. It's a process whereby a competent, terminally ill adult can legally obtain a prescription for a life-ending medication that individual can take when and if they want to take it. And in Oregon, where we've had a law now for a little over 14 years, we find a third of the people that get the prescription never take it. And the number who actually use the law each year is very small, and averages about 40. So it's not an overwhelmingly large number, because people are comforted in knowing that they have a law, that if they're really suffering intolerably, they have a legal right to obtain a medication to end that suffering. And for a lot of people, that's really all they want, just that assurance that if things really get bad, that there's a way out, but in most cases, things really don't get that bad. But it's having that assurance that's really important. One distinction I want to make, too, is that it's not suicide or assisted suicide. You hear the term a lot, physician-assisted suicide, and we don't like that term for a number of reasons. First, suicide is about choosing death over life. Usually when you look at somebody that does have a suicidal ideation, there's an underlying cause. Could be depression, could be involved in a scandal, could be all kinds of problems. Sometimes these are temporary things that are properly identified and treated, that individual can arguably go on to lead a full and productive life. On the other hand, when a person is terminally ill, by definition, they're already dying. So they're not choosing death over life. They're simply choosing one form of death over another, and maybe taking the least worst option of those deaths. And that's why we don't feel that they're committing suicide, if you will, and why we prefer to talk about it as aid in dying. Paradoxes, this is kind of interesting, and one of the things is there's no law in any state in the United States that makes it a crime to end your life. Suicide used to be a crime many, many years ago, but it was decriminalized. I think the last state to decriminalize it did so in about 1960. So it's not against the law for any of us to end our own life if we want to do it. The method that you use might be against the law, like discharging a firearm in city limits or something, but it's the actual act is not against the law. But it is against the law for someone to help you exercise your rights. So that's kind of a paradox. The other paradox, this gets to an argument we made one time in the 14th amendment, adults have a constitutionally protected right to refuse life-sustaining treatment. That can be dialysis, it could be surgery, it could be a blood transfusion, it could be being taken off of a respirator, it could be just stopping taking your high blood pressure medication. Any of these things, even though it's foreseeable that death will occur, you have a constitutionally protected right to do that. But the paradox is if you're terminally ill and suffering and not on life support, you don't have a constitutional right to request a medication to end your life. And even in Oregon and Washington, it's not a constitutional right. It's something that the voters voted in. So those are some of the paradoxes. The arguments for aid and dying, and I'm giving probably the most prominent because there's lots for and against. But the first is personal autonomy and freedom. It's my life, my choice. You know, why should anybody be concerned about what I'm doing to my body? That's probably one of the most compelling ones. You should have the freedom to be the master of your own fate. Justice and equity and equal protection. And I talked a little bit earlier about the right of people that are not even terminally ill to discontinue life support, but we don't have that right for people that are terminally ill. So under a 14th Amendment argument, that just doesn't seem to weigh out. So it is a question, as far as we're concerned about, there should be equal rights and equal protection. So that's another argument in favor. Compassion. If somebody is suffering intolerably, why shouldn't they have the right to end that suffering? You know, why should you have to put up with it? And yes, some faiths believe it's ennobling, and the more you suffer, the closer you are to God. But there's other people that don't believe that, and if they don't believe that, why should they have to subscribe to a set of dogma that other people believe? And then regulation, it's happening anyway. It happens all the time, but it's not regulated, and it's not under controls. And we've read studies where outside of Oregon, where it's legal, the rate is actually 4 times higher. And the problem outside of Oregon is because it's done in secrecy, there aren't the safeguards that are involved in Oregon. And there may be misdiagnosis, and there may be other conditions that are being missed. But because it's being done in secret, those are being missed. So we're saying, make it safe, make it rare, make it legal. The arguments against aid and dying, potential for abuse, the slippery slope. Sure, it's well intended to stop suffering, but if we pass this law, the next thing we know, you're going to put Granny down because she's a burden on you. Or we're going to put away the disabled or the people without a job, or all these other kind of things. So it's a slippery slope. And that's a big argument that the other side uses all the time. And in the 14 years that the Oregon law has been in effect, they've done studies. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that any type of slippery slope has occurred. In fact, it's more utilized by educated, well-to-do people than it is by undereducated, poor, uninsured people. So that's kind of interesting as well. The physician's duty is to heal, not to kill. That's another argument, but really what the physician's duty is to relieve suffering. And if the only way they can relieve suffering is to help the patient end their life, what is wrong with that? That's my argument anyway. These are supposed to be the arguments against it. Legalization would erode the patient trust. When you went into your doctor's office and he said, I need to give you a shot, how would you know whether that's the flu shot or and then the white shot? How would you know? We're certainly all scared of that. Doctors can make mistakes. They may misdiagnose. But one of the things about the Oregon law and the Washington law, it's up to the patient to decide when and if to take that medication. And we find that in a lot of instances, even though the patients have that medication, it may be a year or 2 before they actually use it because they decide. So maybe the doctor says you only have 6 months, and maybe the person has a year and a half. But it's up to them, so it doesn't matter whether there's a misdiagnosis. Nobody gets the medication and immediately takes it. Sanctity of life, all life is sacred, and no matter, it's like a word here's a who, a person's a person, no matter how small, or, if you put it in the Catholic Church doctrine, a life is a life, no matter how inconsequential. So that's another argument. And then miracles can happen. We always hear about this. And that takes me to Anatole France, and he was a French author and poet, and he went to Lourdes, and he was shown about all the miracles and saw all these crutches hanging up there and all of these things. And so he said, "Crois, pas de jambes de bois, which translates into, what? What? No wooden legs? So people were able to walk, but there was no evidence that miracles had happened and people regrew limbs or their eyes, missing eyes grew back or things like that. And that's the problem with miracles. Maybe they do happen, I just have yet to see one. So what stands between you and your right to end life in a humane and peaceful manner? And in a word, no surprise, it's religion. And in any argument, and there are plenty, when we peel back the layers, we find at the heart of the argument is always religion. The church has gotten really good at hiding it, and they voice the argument as slippery slopes or misdiagnosis or other things, but when it really comes down to it, most of the argument has to do with the sanctity of life and suffering, and the more you suffer, the better. So, thou shalt not kill. Actually, most scholars now have decided it really is thou shalt not murder rather than kill, but the Bible demands the faithful to kill. And all this comes subsequent to the sixth commandment. And if we look at that, we're supposed to kill witches and fortune tellers and belligerent children and adulterers and false prophets and not virginal brides and infidels and anybody who works on Sunday. We're supposed to kill them. It's your duty. Think about it when you go to McDonald's this Sunday. Suicide is sin. You won't find it in the Bible. There's 8 biblical suicides with no divine retribution. No, Abimelech, Samson, Saul's armor bearer, Achtophel, Zimri, Razes, and Eliezer. These are all people who ended their lives in the Bible and nothing ever happened. And in fact, Saul is considered pretty high up there, and so is Samson and some of these other people. Now, some faiths even believed that an early death was desirable because it got you into heaven earlier. And there was a group called the Circumcillians who were part of the Donatist sect. And they were one of the groups that believed if you got into heaven early, it was great. And they would all get together in mass and jump off of cliffs. They'd go to church, do their confession, all their sins were absolved, and they'd end their life. Or they would stop people on the road and threaten them and allow the people to retaliate by stabbing them with a sword to end their life. And this all has to do with Tertullian and saying that martyrdom is the best thing you can do, and so they all wanted to be martyrs. Now, it didn't become a sin until 1420, when Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce it, when he was writing in the City of God, decided that to end your life was the sin of pride. And part of the problem was so many people were killing themselves off. They were fearful that if this continued, there wouldn't be any more Christians. So it had to stop. So what's all this have to do with your right to a dignified death, you're probably asking at this point. Well, the church, realizing it couldn't exert control over the legal system to prevent abortion, contraception, euthanasia, stem cell therapy, all these other kind of things, did figure out, oh, wait a minute, if we can't control the law, let's control the system that delivers these services. And that's what they did. They started buying up hospitals. The game of co-opoly. Today, 1 out of every 5 hospital beds in this country is under Catholic control. And in 2002 was 1 in 6, so you can see that they're gaining. Catholic healthcare systems now control 13% of community hospitals. And every year about 30% of Americans receive some form of medical care from a Catholic-managed healthcare hospital or institution. So again, what's this have to do with your rights to a dignified death? Has to do with the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare, the ERDs, or as we like to call them, the ERDs. The ERDs are healthcare service directives, and they document the moral guidance drawn from the Catholic Church. All the popes and bishops got together and decided what was going to be acceptable and what wasn't in terms of medical care and medical delivery. And let's look at some of these ERDs. And I've only selected the ones that really have to do with end-of-life and health issues, because there's a whole other section that has to do with contraception and abortion and stem cell research. But I'm just looking at the ones that have to do with our topic tonight. ERD number 5, first of all, says that the Catholic Healthcare Service has to, they must adopt these practices. They must. It's not optional, they must. And they also must require adherence to them. And what happens is when a doctor goes to work for a Catholic hospital or health facility, typically they're required to sign a document that says basically they are under Catholic control, and even in their own office, even if they're making house calls, they are signing a document that says they're going to subscribe to those ethical and religious directives. So they don't have a choice. Now, we know with a wink and a nod, outside of the hospital, some things do happen, but it doesn't happen with all of them. But they do sign a document in most cases that says, no matter where you are Catholic now. We don't care what your religious background is, you're subscribing to these ethical and religious directives. And we'll see what kind of problems those cause. ERD number 6, again, the organization should be the responsible steward of healthcare resources, and they should collaborate with other institutions in providing the best care. But what if the other institution that can provide that best care is not a Catholic institution? They're not going to refer you to that. So if you're in a hospital and you're on life support and you could be referred some other place that would be willing to discontinue your life support, a Catholic hospital is not going to approve a transfer for you. And we'll talk a little bit towards the end about things you can do on that. But this is the kind of control that they're really exerting over people that are in Catholic healthcare facilities. Has to be in ways that do not compromise Catholic social and moral teaching. So even if you go elsewhere, you still have to be faithful. ERD number 24. In compliance with federal law, they have to give patients information about their rights, including the right to make an advanced health care directive, the living will, which allows you to state what kind of treatment you don't want or want at the end of life. But the institution will not honor your advanced directive if it's contrary to Catholic teaching. So you can say in your directive, if I'm in a comatose, persistent vegetative state with no hope of recovery, I don't want to be maintained on artificial life support, in a Catholic hospital, they're not going to honor that particular directive. And that was the exact situation with the Terry Schiavo case. She could have lived arguably for another 40 years, so she was never going to recover, but because she was not terminally ill, according to the Catholic Church, she should have been maintained indefinitely. ERD number 25. Each person can identify somebody in advance to be their proxy or their agent, appoint somebody, in other words, to make decisions for them in the event they're unresponsive and unable to make decisions on their own behalf. But again, the decision should be faithful to Catholic moral principles. So again, we have that level of control. ERD number 28. Each person or the person's surrogate should have access to medical and moral information and counseling about to be able to form his or her own conscious and the free informed healthcare decision of the person or the person's surrogate is to be followed, again, as long as it does not contradict Catholic principles. So, exactly. So they give it all, and they give. When I was in the insurance industry, we talked about the policy gives it all, and then the endorsements take it all away. And it's sort of the same thing here. ERD number 58. In principle, there's an obligation to provide patients with food and water, including medically assisted nutrition and hydration for those who cannot take it orally. And the obligation extends to patients in a chronic and presumably irreversible condition. And they specifically name the persistent vegetative state. And they can, even if they're expected to live indefinitely. So there we go. Again, if your wishes are not to be kept alive if you're a vegetable and you're in a Catholic institution, you're going to have a problem with that. ERD number 59. The free and informed judgment made by a competent adult patient concerning the use or withdrawal of life support sustaining procedures should always be respected, unless it's contrary to Catholic moral teaching. ERD 60. Now this is interesting because the Catholic Church actually defines euthanasia. They say it's an act or omission that of itself or by intention causes death, and therefore it should never be condoned. Now what's interesting is based on their definition. So if you are on life support and the doctor pulls the plug, for lack of a more tactful term, that's with the intention of causing you death. And so that should never be condoned. If you want to refuse dialysis, that should never be condoned. So these are problems. And again, remember earlier I said, not only does the institution have these principles that are supposed to be subscribed to, but the doctors, the nurses, everybody working within an institution. Now there's lots of things that they do to get tricky. Some of you might be familiar with the 5 Wishes document. And the 5 Wishes document it's an end-of-life living will or advanced healthcare directive, and it's actually a very well-written document for the most part. The only problem is it was written under the influence of the Catholic Church. And ERD 60 was worked into there. And wish number 2 says, what you should keep in mind, I do not want anything done or omitted by my doctor or nurses with the intention of taking my life. And on the surface, that sounds pretty good. Who would want to go to the hospital and be killed? But as I mentioned, turning off a respirator, discontinuing dialysis, not giving a blood transfusion, not giving you antibiotics if you have a life-threatening infection, those are all things that are done by a doctor or omitted by a doctor that you might not say it's with the intention per se, but it's certainly with the foreseeability that it's going to cause death. So these are all no-nos under this healthcare system. And then my personal favorite is 61. Since a person has the right to prepare for his death while fully conscious, he or she should not be deprived of consciousness unless there's really compelling reasons. So if you're experiencing suffering that cannot be alleviated, you should be taught to appreciate the understanding of Christian redemptive suffering. And it gets weirder than that. You know, one of the directives allows them to baptize you if you weren't baptized and you were near death, whether you want it or not. So, you know, there's all these kind of things. This just shows presently the number of facilities in Colorado that are under Catholic control, and I kind of highlighted the ones that are in Colorado Springs. And these are under direct Catholic control. There's lots of other places that they may have a part ownership in, a 50-50 ownership. And so all of the directives might not be enforced at that particular point. But what's happening is they're waiting for a time when they can then take it over and then put the full ERDs in. Another thing is the ERDs are subject to the interpretation of the local archbishop. So it's up to his whims. I was going to say his or hers, but that wouldn't work, would it? It's up to his whims as to how he wants to interpret something. And we've seen, for instance, we had an archbishop in New Mexico who was very open when a merger took place with a Catholic hospital and said, we're not going to change anything from the way it previously was, despite the ERDs. And he caught flack for that, but you know, that does happen. But in other areas, they can decide how strictly they want these to be interpreted. So it can be a problem. And I'm happy to say that the bishop that we had up in the Denver area has gotten moved to Philadelphia to deal with some little boy issues, and so we won't have him there because he was very, very much opposed to anything that had to do with end-of-life care and control and so forth. So, you know, what can you do? We pointed out like all the horror stories, if you will. You know, what can you do as an individual to kind of increase your the chances that your wishes will be followed? And I do want to point out I use the term wishes, and these are wishes. And not all wishes come true, But the idea is there are things you can do to improve the odds. So there's a couple of things you can do. Most importantly is have a conversation with friends, family, particularly your doctor. And one of the documents that I put on the table back there is called A Letter to My Doctor, and I have a slide on it in a moment that I'll talk about. But it basically lays out the groundwork for your doctor about this is what I want and don't want, and I want you to understand this. And if your doctor says, well, gee, I'm not going to comply with any of that, I don't believe in it, you may want to find another doctor. And the point is, you might want to find out now while you can before you're in the hospital bed and there's nothing else you can do. It might be a tough conversation to have, but it's also a good way to find out how uninformed your doctors are. I had one doctor, and I was with one of these programs where every year you get a new doctor and a new company because it's like who's ever the cheapest. And I always would ask, if I'm suffering, would you help me to the extent you can? And I would get all kinds of answers. Oh yes, I would write you a prescription for this. And we know, because we deal with people that take medication in their lives, that what they're offering to prescribe would not do the trick. So the doctors don't even know. And that's one of the reasons why we have to have this regulated, like it is in Oregon and Washington, so that we know we're getting effective doses and getting the correct medication. So that conversation has to take place. This little book called The Good to Go Guide talks about how to have that conversation. How do you approach it with your family, with your relatives? How do you initiate that if you're not comfortable with doing it? So I encourage you to take one of these and read it. And it's also available on our website as a download. If you have a friend in another state or another area, you can send them a link and they can download the document for themselves. If you haven't completed an Advanced Healthcare Directive, please do. You can download a Colorado-specific Advanced Healthcare Directive from our website. If you don't have access to the internet, we'd be happy to send you one. If you have 5 wishes, if you use that document, be aware of wish number 2, and you might want to annotate it, or you might want to find another document to use. Be aware that all documents are not created equal, and that there is no state-specific Advanced Healthcare Directive. You could simply write on the back of a napkin, if I seem to be in pain, pull the plug, and that would be just as binding as a 4-page document as long as it's signed and witnessed. So there's no official Advanced Healthcare Directive. So a lot of places, the Right to Life groups, for instance, pass out what's known as a will to live, not a living will. And it incorporates all these things about I want everything tried and do everything and keep me alive as long as I can from birth to natural death, which is kind of interesting because even the American Medical Association says there's no such thing as a natural death. We've yet to see somebody who's died naturally. We all die something, but it's not natural. So complete the directive. Fill out the dementia and sectarian healthcare forms. I'm going to talk about those in a moment. And those can help in situations where you are in a Catholic or religiously run facility. Again, no guarantee, but it shows your intent and it increases the odds. And then, if you think there's been any violation for yourself or a loved one, you can contact Compassion Choices. We file lawsuits against doctors, against churches. We don't always win, but sometimes we do pass laws. We had a case out in California, a guy named Bill Bergman. He was a terminally ill cancer patient. His doctor refused to give him anything stronger than Demerol, which they don't even use anymore. On a scale of 1 to 10 in pain, he was a 10 every single day. He got released to go home to die on the last day. Hospice came in, pumped him up full of morphine. For the first time in months, he was able to relax and be pain-free. And he died shortly thereafter, not of the morphine, but of just being able to be relaxed. The family contacted us and said, can you help us? And it was in California, and like most states, when you die, your claim dies with you unless you have direct dependents. And Bill Bergman was 70-some-odd years old. All his kids were emancipated. They weren't living at home. Nobody was dependent upon him. So we couldn't sue for pain and suffering, which you can do in some states, although very few states. So our legal affairs director said, you know what? California has an elder abuse statute. Let's sue for elder abuse. Mm-hmm. And we sued for elder abuse. And we won. And we got a $2.5 million judgment against the doctor. And that wasn't the victory. The victory was immediately after we won, the Assembly passed a law that now requires every doctor in California, except for radiologists and dermatologists and a few others, to take 14 hours of continuing medical education in end-of-life pain management to get licensed or relicensed. And they set up a board to monitor complaints of over or under treatment of pain. So now in California, there's tens of thousands of people who are getting better access to end-of-life care just because of this one case. And we tried to pass this law in other states. Our biggest opponent has been the American Medical Association. They say we can police ourselves, we don't need another policeman. And so they have fought this where we try to introduce it elsewhere. It doesn't stop us. So if you know of a case, we can always move forward and try and go forward with it. Okay, one of the documents, as I mentioned, is the letter to my doctor. And it has little check boxes. If I'm able to speak for myself, my wishes will be honored. If not, the request from my healthcare representative and advance directives will be honored. And you want the doctor to agree to this. That in other words, the doctor's not going to be the decision maker. You or your appointed proxy are going to be the decision maker. You will make a referral to hospice should I request it. Funny thing about a lot of doctors, they're not willing to admit their patient is dying. You're eligible for hospice enrollment basically 6 months from the time of your projected death. Most patients get into hospice within the last week or 2 weeks. You can't get into hospice without a doctor referral. Why can't you get in earlier? Part of the problem is the doctors are not willing to admit that you're dying. Or as Dr. Stevens of the Christian Medical and Dental Society says, there's always one more thing we can try. Never, never, never quit. And that's their basic philosophy. And so they don't want to throw in the towel, and they don't want to do that hospice referral. So you want your doctor to agree that if you request it and you qualify, you want to be able to have that request to be transferred in. And then you'll support me with all the options for a gentle death, including medications I can self-administer to make my death as peaceful as possible. And I'm not requesting you do anything unethical while I'm in your care. So in a state outside of Oregon or Washington or Montana, where you can get a prescription for life-ending medication, that medication may be a lot of morphine to ease pain. It may be something else, and that's all you're asking for. I want you to agree you're going to do whatever you can to manage my pain. So that's the letter to my doctor, and it's good to have the doctor sign off on that and keep a copy, make sure the doctor has a copy in his or her file. The dementia provision is one we came up with because a lot of people, growing number of people, are more concerned about dementia and living in a fetal state, not being aware of their surroundings, but being kept alive by tube feeding. And we all have heard stories of people who can live for 10 or 15 or 20 years, not even knowing whether it's day or night. So we developed a dementia provision that can be part of your advanced healthcare directive. Basically, it states, if I remain conscious but have a progressive illness that will be fatal, and the illness is an advanced stage, and I am consistently and permanently unable to communicate, swallow food and water safely, care for myself, and recognize my family and other people, I would like my wishes regarding specific life-sustaining treatments is indicated on the attached document entitled My Particular Wishes to be followed. And one of those is if I am unable to feed myself while in this condition, I do or don't want to be fed. So if you can't feed yourself safely, you're saying, I don't want a tube stuck in, and guess what? You're going to die. And it's not going to be that protracted, and it's not going to be that painful. And I'll segue to a short commercial here. In this same room on August 19th, Friday at noon, we're giving a presentation on voluntary stopping of eating and drinking as a means of hastening your death when you can't get medication like you can in Oregon and Washington. And we're going to provide information on how, when you made this decision, it is a very peaceful way to go. And what happens typically after you have not had hydration for a certain number of days, you start to develop kidney failure, you become terminally ill, and then you qualify for hospice, whether or not you qualified for it before. And hospice can come in and then give you morphine and do whatever else they can to manage your symptoms and discomfort and make sure that you have peaceful passage. So that's the dementia provision. One of the other things within that form, you can also say, if I develop a life-threatening infection, I don't want antibiotics administered. And anybody today in a hospital or a nursing home or assisted living facility, there's a darn good chance you're going to get some kind of infection. You know, there's all kinds of staph infections running around. Do you know what the #7 leading cause of death in this country is right now? Septicemia, blood poisoning. Where does it come from? Catheters, IVs, all those kind of things. There's a very good chance that if you're in an institution, you're going to develop a life-threatening infection. And what do they do if somebody's demented nowadays? They simply give them penicillin or tetracycline or ampicillin or whatever other kind of cillins they have, and they say, "Whoop, we got through this one. We'll just have to wait to see what happens on the next one." So, but that's just something to think about. We've also developed a religious and conscience refusal clause. And that's basically saying, if the healthcare institution in which I'm a patient declines to follow my wishes as set out in my directive, I want to be transferred in a timely manner to a hospital, nursing home, or other institution that will agree to honor those instructions. And again, it's no guarantee you're going to get transferred out, but it's stating your wishes. I don't want to be here, and maybe they will then kick you out. Now, we've talked a lot within Compassion Choices about what if we could get a law passed that said if you get medical treatment you don't want, you don't have to pay for it. That would stop the whole thing. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to take it there. And because when you're at the end of life, Medicare, Medicaid, most of these things, it's just, people don't want to go there. So, we're basically come to the end of the presentation. Hope you all enjoyed that. And I just open it up for questions, answers, anything else you'd like to ask. Yes, sir.
What are the chances of getting something in Colorado like the states of Oregon and Washington have?
Very, very remote.
Why?
Basically, when we look at Oregon, Washington, and Vermont, which is going to have another go at it next year, they rank number 1, 2, and 3 respectively for the least religious states in the United States. Colorado comes in around 34, I think. The number of people that claim absolutely no religion in those states is high compared to Colorado. We have a problem that we've got a legislature that's pretty much, I'm going to get way off track here, but if you're familiar with Prohibition, if anybody can remember back that far, and you probably can't, there was a guy named Wheeler who wanted Prohibition passed. And he went to politicians and he promised them 10% of the vote if they would vote for Prohibition. He said, I don't care where you stand on any other issues, you vote against Prohibition, I will give you 10% of the vote. And he got a lot of people to go ahead and say they would vote for Prohibition to get elected. Nowadays, when elections are won by 1 and 2 and 3%, it's even a smaller margin, and we're seeing that same thing being promised. And studies have been, political science studies have been done on this. A really big study was done at Strom University up there in Denver, looking at all of these failed attempts and saying it's this small percentage that happens to not only have the money, but have the political influence, and they are going to be the one that sway the outcomes when it comes to dealing with the legislature. So that's one of the problems we have. It's a real problem, and if you look at it, and Harvey and I were discussing this during dinner, to date there have been 95 bills introduced in various state legislatures around the country. Not a single one has made it as far as the governor's desk percentage. Not a single bill out of 95. And what happens is every time there's a loss, the right to life uses that loss, and next time a bill's been introduced, they say, gee, you know what? 95 attempts have been made before, and not a single one's failed, so why do you want to pass it now? It's very clear, the people are very clear, the legislature is very clear, we don't want this law. It's a problem. And we realize it's a problem. One of the things you have in Colorado, which you don't have in a lot of other states, is you do have a voter initiative process. You can collect signatures on a petition, get it on a ballot for the public to vote on. We find by and large that 65% of the public support the option for aid and dying. But one of the problems you have is it's very expensive. It would cost about $12 million in Colorado. You have a very high Hispanic population, which also tends to be Catholic. And what happens, and I saw this in Hawaii, where I was dealing directly with the Death with Dignity bill out there, from the pew, they told people to be a good Catholic, you have to contact your legislator tomorrow and tell them do not vote for this bill. And then they passed a separate collection basket to raise funds to buy advertising to go against aid and dying. And because it was individual donations in 10s, 20s, whatever, there was no paper trail, and it didn't have to be declared, and they raised tens of thousands of dollars that way, and nobody knew where the money came from. So we're up against a very polished and organized machine. And that's a very complicated answer to your answer.
What about Supreme Court challenges under religious persecution?
You know, the Supreme Court doesn't like to go anywhere. We've tried twice with the Supreme Court to argue once under the 14th Amendment equal protection, once a constitutional right. In both cases, they just said, no, we're not even going to go there, and threw it out. The chances of that are very, very slim. I don't want to, if the opportunity happens, we would go there. We would take it to
What do you need to have to try to go there?
Well, we would need somebody to file a lawsuit initially in a state claiming that their religious beliefs and faiths have been violated based on a particular act. It would have to be upheld in the lower court. It would then have to be appealed. It would have to survive that appeal, and then it would have to then go to the Supreme Court.
What would you have to do to have standing to get it started?
You have to be terminally ill, so you wouldn't live long.
Everybody's terminally ill. We're all terminally ill.
Well, no, but I mean.
Well, by those definitions, right? It's
Yeah, but if you go under the 6-month rule, it takes 4 years to get through the court system, so this doesn't work.
Gotcha, that's the problem.
Are you talking?
Well, it is a problem, although in the cases we did take to the Supreme Court, some of our plaintiffs had died between the time we filed the
Then the
lawsuit.
court case stopped, didn't it?
Well, no, they still went forward because we had the testimony of the individuals through depositions and things like that, but it just wasn't enough. So, you know, I would say if anybody has a case like that, we would be more than happy to talk about it. You know, and we can see about taking something forward like that. It's no guarantee it'll happen. But we are always looking for creative ways and challenges to do things.
Are you talking about the Colorado Supreme Court or the
It
Roman
would have to
Catholic
get-
Supreme
It would have to
Court?
get to the United States Supreme Court
Because
because
those Catholics.
The one that
yes,
has 6 Roman
it is
Catholics?
It's under Catholic control. You have to, because even if you got it in the Colorado Supreme Court, somebody's going to feel that it's going to get
And the Colorado taxpayers have to pay the bill.
Yes, sir.
Isn't it ironic that a dignified and comfortable death is something that we routinely offer for our dog or our cat, but we can't do it for our husband or wife or
That's
parent?
because we have a soul.
Well, you know, what I find interesting is the church is all about getting to heaven. That's where redemption is. That's where life begins. But they're trying to keep us from getting there. So, I mean, yeah, but yeah, I mean, none of this makes sense.
How much does the taxpayer have to pay the Catholic Church for 1 month of life support? For example, Terry Schiavo or someone. So in other words, if they can extend it 1 month before they put you on hospice, how much would that 1 month be worth to them in taxpayer funding?
I don't have an exact number, but in ICU, if all you're doing is being maintained, you know, it runs about $2,500 a day.
There you
And
go.
that can vary based on.
Could that be the reason?
Well, what happens is they get that back from Medicare and Medicaid.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're paying for it.
And
Yeah.
Medicare and Medicaid would be broke if we could get through this problem.
Yes, sir.
The studies you said about in Oregon where all the myths were debunked, where can I find that?
Actually, there's a number of studies, and if you want to give me your name, I can send it to you. The most compelling one was done by Peggy Batten, who is a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. Utah, and she did it in connection with a physician, and they reviewed all the evidence in Oregon and also in the Netherlands, and they concluded, and this was based on 10 years of study, the Oregon law is now 14 years old, that there was no evidence whatsoever of any vulnerable groups being targeted. And they were finding utilization tend to be, and this is a demographic, white, well-to-do, insured people who are enrolled in hospice, who have cancer 85% of the time. The rest of the time was ALS or other type diseases. I mean, the demographics are really interesting. I mean, it's none of the groups. It's not the underprivileged. It's not the uninsured. It's not minorities. It's not the disabled. But hers is the most compelling. But there are other studies that have been done that shows that there's just no slippery slope. It's not happening. In the Oregon website itself, by law in Oregon and Washington, the doctors have to file forms that talk about all those issues and did you cover these type of things. And the results are there for anybody who wants to visit those websites to look at. So it's the Oregon Department of Human Services, and I think it would just go, if you Googled Washington death with dignity act, it would take you to the Washington one and you'd see the reports. The Washington law has only been in effect for 2 years, so it doesn't have as much data, but the data is very, very similar to the Oregon data, which is exactly what was expected, because it's based on the Oregon law. We're following the same protocols and the same procedures.
You know, you see these cases where a pharmacist or a hospital will deny contraception or something like that because they're against it. Is there some way to make it against the law to deny legal services?
The problem you run into when it gets back to the right to religious freedom, and they do have, every time they pass the law that would require pharmacists to fill an otherwise legally written prescription, the Catholic Church comes in and says, well, wait a minute, you know, we're against that. You know, and what happens is they say, okay, we'll give you an exemption. You know, everybody has to comply except. And we find that in a lot of states. There are a number of states who said, there are just a handful right now that say a legal prescription has to be filled, and if your pharmacist is not willing to do it, they have to refer you to another pharmacist who is willing to, or you have to have somebody on staff who is willing to fill that prescription. But that's only a handful of states. In most states, it's up to the conscience of the particular pharmacist, and he or she can just say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to fill that prescription, and they don't even have to tell you you can go somewhere else. And it's worse, too, because it's the same thing with emergency contraception. You can be a rape victim and go into a Catholic hospital, and they say, well, geez, we're sorry you were raped, you know, we'll call the police and we'll fill out a report, and, you know, we'll get you a taxi ride home. They don't even have to tell them about emergency contraception. Now, in Colorado, they do. Hospital doesn't have to comply, but you at least need to be made aware that you have the option. You know, so we'd love to have laws like that, but again, it gets to that question, if you start dictating what another religion is doing or how another religion should act, then are we kind of becoming what we're fighting against? So it's just one of those things. Yes?
I'm a Colorado resident. If I went to avail myself the Oregon, Washington, or Montana laws, what do I have to do? Can I move there and become a citizen? How long does it take? Will doctors accept me? What's the story?
Great question. In Oregon, Washington, and Montana, it simply says legal resident, and it doesn't specify specifically what a legal resident is, but it does set guidelines and says, for the doctor, residency can be demonstrated by a driver's license, proof that you own property in the state, proof that you paid the most recent income taxes, filed your income taxes for that particular state. So yes, and Harvey and I were talking about this during dinner, you can move there and you can establish residency, but if you're terminally ill, you have the problem of first getting there, going through the process of establishing residency, which in a minimum is probably going to take 30 days. Then you have to find a doctor who's willing to not only take you on as a new patient, but also be supportive of aid and dying. You have to have that second referral from another doctor saying that the first doctor's diagnosis was correct, and you have the 15-day waiting period and other, other things that you have to go through. Can it be done? Yes, but you can't just get on a plane and fly there. And we're not aware of any cases where anybody's actually gone to Oregon specifically to use the law. We do know of people who have moved there with the foresight of saying, you know, if it gets to that point, I want to live in a state where I have that option. Now, there is an organization in Switzerland called Dignitas, and they will take all comers if you're terminally ill, and in some cases if you're not terminally ill. But right now, the going rate is about $10,000 US. It's based on the fluctuation of the euro. And sometimes they have a 6-month waiting list. So you have that problem too. And if you're suffering at the end of life, do you really want to get on a plane? Do you really want to move somewhere away from your family and your support system?
There's a documentary on that.
I'm sorry?
There's a video on it, oh, I did that.
Yeah. I think it was called tourism or something. So, you know, but you know, and the thing is, if it were legal for anybody to move to Oregon and Washington, then there'd be no incentive to pass it in other states either. So that's another thing. Yes?
I have farmers' auto insurance, and a few years ago, they started the preferred provider option. I got a list of the hospitals around the state that I should use should I be in an auto accident. In town here, they only listed the Catholic one, and I noticed there were a lot of Catholic ones all around the state. So I contacted my agent and really disputed that, and they did change it. They did put Memorial on the list, but you have to be careful if you have the preferred provider option.
Well, that's the
You
thing.
may have to go to a Catholic hospital.
You have to advocate for yourself. In one of the cases that we filed a lawsuit in, we had a case called the Margaret Furlong case, and she had advanced health care directive, including no CPR, and she was taken to the hospital because she was complaining of stomach cramps. And she had her advanced health care directive with her DNR in her hands, went into cardiac arrest, Catholic hospital. They brought her back. They broke a lot of ribs in the process because they had to do, like, you know, heavy chest compressions. She didn't regain consciousness, but was in extreme pain for 10 days before she died. And the family came to us, and we filed a lawsuit against the hospital and the doctor and the church. I mean, the court, the church, basically threw it out and said, "Well, it's bad, but it's not bad enough." So, I mean, you know, these are the kind of things we see. It doesn't stop us from fighting.
What does it have to be bad enough?
You know, it's all going to depend a lot on who the judge and who the jury are.
And how
And
much
how they
money
see
the
it.
Catholic Church can make
Yeah, I mean,
in
really,
10
it's,
days of intensive care.
it's really tough. So, but we keep trying. We keep moving forward with these, and we do try them, and we probably win one for every 10 we lose. And we try and stop hospital mergers. You might have heard about the one we were working on up in Denver with Exempla Healthcare that was going to be taken over by the Sisters of Charity. And we fought that one long and hard, and we basically lost because the Attorney General said, "I'm not even going to hear your arguments." He happens to be Catholic,
Right.
though, you know, I'm sure that had nothing to do with it. But now they're under Catholic control. And now, guess what? They're laying off 160 people because they say, well, you know, all this money we thought we had when we said we were going to buy you out, we don't have it anymore.
You know anything about the possibility that Memorial might change as far as its status?
The which?
Memorial Hospital, so you don't
Is
have
that the
to
only one you got?
I don't know.
That's
A
what
lot of
they
people
do.
think that it might get bumped by
Yeah,
that
so.
person and we wouldn't have that power.
Yeah, again, we work very closely with a group called Merchant Watch, and their whole function is to try and root out potential takeovers, acquisitions, whatever, of hospitals. And when that happens, we coalesce with them and try and get our members and supporters to stop it. And we just stopped one down in Sierra Vista, Arizona. It took a year, but we had people every single day picketing the church. Every single day, they were out in front with signs, "Don't take away my rights." And finally, the Catholic Church came up with some excuse. Well, we just decided after thinking about it for a year, you know, no, we don't want to do it. But we really know underneath it all, it's because they were out there every single day picketing. That was a win. We don't have a lot of them, but, you know, we do get an occasional victory.
Yes.
When you began, you said that this is the first time you've spoken with Satan's slaves, and yet a lot of your presentations seem to be a little critical toward churches. Is this a standard presentation you do, or did you custom make this for us slaves?
I was asked to talk about religion, and So is it a standard presentation? If we're talking about religion, it is.
Right. But it's not what you normally make.
Normally, we talk about the Oregon law, the Washington law, we talk about the statistics, we talk about things along that nature, or we talk about workshops on advanced healthcare directives. The one we're going to be talking about when I'm down here on the 19th is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, and how that process works and how you can exercise your rights for that. And the Catholic Church may pop up in that one with the caveat, you know, if you're under Catholic healthcare, that could be an impediment. It won't have the same level of focus.
Right.
So, but we try and tailor our presentations to our audience. We're not a one-size-fits-all kind of organization.
Why is it the people who don't have imaginary friends have rights too?
I'm sorry.
Why is it the people who don't have imaginary friends have rights also?
Imaginary.
Roland, I wanted to thank you
Yeah, we're
very
just
much.
Let's stick around for a couple of minutes if there's any questions people had that we didn't get a chance to answer.